What's up guys, Justin here with the CGEssentials.com. So in today's video, we're going to talk about a way to create really realistic lighting for your scenes using HDRIs in Blender. Let's go ahead and just jump into it. All right, so one of the things that can be an issue with Blender is while you have artificial light options, they're not necessarily always what you're looking for, right? So I've got this car that I got from the traffic starter library, and if I render this right now, notice how nothing is happening. The reason nothing is happening is because there's no lights in our scene. And so what you might think that you'd want to do is you might want to come in here and do a Shift A and add a sun. And then what that does is that creates this artificial sun in your scene that you can use in order to light this when it renders out. But the problem is it's not very realistic, right? You're getting some reflections off of your object, but overall this just isn't how exterior things are rendered or seen in the real world. And so what we need is some better lighting. And so in this case, what we want to use is we want to use a really realistic form of light called an HDRI image. All right, and so first off, let's talk about where to get HDRI images. So the best place for everyone to start to get HDRI images is a website called POLYHAVE.com. It has a ton of freely available assets that you can download, from HDRIs to textures to models. Well, in this case, we want to click on the option for HDRIs. That's going to show you a list of different HDRI images that you can bring in. And if you look at these, you can see that basically what these are images that contain lighting information. One thing that I've learned working with HDRIs is in addition to the image, which can act as a background, you also want to pay attention to these little shader spheres on each one of these images, because these are going to show you the kind of shadows that the HDRI images are going to cast. And so the shadows are different because every one of these is taken at a different time of day, meaning the sun is at a different height, and there's also different clouds in here, and it all kind of affects the way that the shadows work in your scene. And so let's say we wanted to create something in here that has an image in the background. So I like this rural asphalt road because the shadows are kind of pronounced. But what we would want to do is we would want to take this image file and we would want to download it. So if I click in here, notice how this is going to show me information about the image. So you can see the scene. You can also click over here and you can see both a rendered image with the scene, as well as a bigger view of these shader spheres. You can also click on the 3D button in order to see what this HDRI image is going to look like in 3 dimensions. So you can click and drag like this. And I'm not actually a massive fan of this one because it's got a bunch of trees in the foreground, but we'll go ahead and bring it in anyway. Now, when you download an HDRI image, there's options for what you can download here. The first is going to be the resolution, or notice the size of the file when I change the resolution. So if I bring the resolution down, notice how this is a small file. If I was to select 24K, notice how this is going to be a 750 megabyte HDRI file, which might be a little bit of overkill. So we're going to take a look at this, and some of this kind of depends on what you're trying to do. If you're just going to try to light your scene, you maybe don't need a super high resolution. I try to go in the middle because the resolution of this image is going to affect how clear your HDRI background is inside of Blender. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to pick the 4K right here. Notice how you have options in here for HDR and EXR. There's an explanation of both of these, but notice how that EXR is going to be losslessly compressed, meaning it's going to be a larger file, but it might look a little bit better. I usually go with the .hdr file. So those usually work just fine for me. But what I want to do is I want to click on the option for download. And when I download this, it's going to download that HDR file and I can bring it into Blender. So let's jump back over into Blender and let's set this up. And so the place where you're going to set up HDRI lighting is going to be in the shader tab. And so if I click on the drop down right here and I open up the shader editor, notice how this is going to give me the ability to adjust those shaders. Well, I want to click on the little drop down and I want to click on the option for world. And so when I click on the option for world, notice how you've got this very simple node setup. And so you could use this to adjust the brightness of the background in here as well as the color of the background. If you wanted to do that, notice how when you do that, the color of the light that's being cast in here is being affected as well. Well, in this case, we don't necessarily want that. What we want to do is we want to take that environment that we just downloaded and we want to set this up as a background. And so what we need to do now is we need to add a node that's going to read that image and bring it in. So you can either go to add or you can do a Shift A in this space, and we want to look for an environment texture node. So you can find that by going into texture or just by searching for it. So that's what I usually do, is I just type in the name of what I'm looking for. That's going to bring in a node that looks like this. Now, if I take this node, plug it into the color, notice how everything is going to turn pink. The reason everything is going to turn pink is because this environment texture node is supposed to reference a file, and we have not currently told this where to look for that file. So what we need to do is we need to click on the open button and we need to go find that HDR file that we just downloaded. And so in this case, I'm just going to find Rural Asphalt Road HDR and bring this in. Well, notice how now when I bring this in, I can go ahead and I can delete out that sun that we created. And notice how this background is going to act as the background in my scene, like this. And so at the moment, what that's done is that's basically taken that background and it's just like placed it as a background in my scene right here. Well, notice what it's doing, and you kind of have to toggle over into cycles to see this. Notice how there's no shadows in Eevee. If I toggle over into cycles, notice how the scene is basically using the brightest part of the scene, which is right here, I think, but it's using that in order to cast light in my scene. It's actually over here. And so that lighting information inside of your HDR image is being used in order to generate your shadows and your lighting in your scene. And so one of the cool things about this is, say that I was to add a sphere. So I'm just going to do a Shift A. We're going to add a UV sphere right here. We'll set it to shade smooth. And I'm going to add a reflective material. So I'm just going to click on new, set my roughness down to 0, maybe my metallic up to high right here. And maybe I won't set my roughness to 0, I'll set it to something a little bit lower. But notice how at the moment what's happening is this environment, at least according to Blender, is actually like in the scene, meaning you actually get reflections off of the environment just like this. So you can actually see reflections of the clouds and other things like that. So basically you're using this image as the background in your rendered scene. Now let's say that we wanted to rotate this, right? So like for example, this car, I kind of want it to be looking so that it's down the road right here. And I might even delete out this plane in a little bit, but we're not going to worry about that for right now. Well, at the moment, that HDRI image is in here and it's kind of rotated in a way that I don't like. Now, I could come in here and I could take this car and I could just rotate it that way. So I could select the object and rotate it so that it aligns with the surface. But in this case, I want to rotate the background. And so in order to be able to do that, we need to add a little bit more information to our node setup. And so in order to do this, this is going to be very similar to what we do when we set up mapping for a texture on an object. And so the first thing I want to do is I want to do a Shift A and I want to add a texture coordinate node. And I'm going to take this, I'm going to click right in here, and I'm going to drag that generated into the vector. And so notice how nothing happened yet. And so we basically told it to take those texture coordinates and just generate them, and then we're plugging it in here. So we haven't really changed anything. To change something, we need a tool called a mapping node. So we're going to do a Shift A, we're going to do a search, and we're going to look for a mapping node. I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to drop that right in here. And so when we do that, what we want to do is we want to take the generated node and plug it into the vector. Then we want to take the vector and plug it into the vector over here. What that does is that gives us the ability to make adjustments to this image. right? So like, for example, I can adjust the location of the image. Now, I don't necessarily recommend that you do this, but you can. What we want to focus on in this situation is we want to focus on the rotation. Well, notice how if I rotate the Z value of this HDRI image, this is going to actually rotate the image itself right here. And so I can use this to rotate my HDRI image in order to set this up so that it aligns the way that I want. And in this situation, we might even get rid of this plane right here, just depending on the way that your image is going to look. In this case, I'm going to leave the plane in, but notice how we can use this mapping setup in order to adjust this image. Now, you can come in here and adjust some things like the scale and other things like that. I don't mess with those too much just because those tend to kind of distort the image and create some issues, but you can definitely do that. Okay, and so let's say that we wanted to just use the light from this image without the image itself. You can do that by coming in here and adjusting your node setup. So at the moment, what this is doing is this is adding the image as a background inside of your model. Well, in this case, what I want to do is I want to keep that background, that kind of like gray color. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a Shift D and I'm going to duplicate this background. And so then we're going to have two backgrounds in here and we're going to mix them together. So to do that, I'm going to do a Shift A and I'm going to add a Mix Shader node. So click in here, create the Mix Shader node right here. Well, notice how at the moment, this isn't really doing very much, right? It's basically set up where you can toggle between one or the other. And if I toggle between the one and the other, then I'm actually losing all of my lighting. And so what we need is we need a factor in here that's going to tell this where to put the background and where to keep the lighting. So to do that, we're going to add a light path node in here like this. And in this situation, we're going to take the camera ray setting, we're going to drag it into our factor. So basically what that means is that this is going to look at this and this is going to apply the lighting to the object, but it's not actually going to show the image itself. So we can still come in here and adjust the rotation. Notice how when we adjust that rotation, things like our shadows are still moving in here and you can actually see the reflection of the HDRI image in the sphere that we created, but we've actually got kind of we've actually got a clear background in here that's just a color. And then you could come in here and you could adjust that color to whatever you want. Notice how it's just kind of getting dropped in the background. It's not really affecting the lighting of your scene, but you can definitely make that adjustment. All right, so one of the issues we're running into right now, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to leave this as my background. So I'll leave this 100% as this object. One of the issues that we're running into right now is that this doesn't really look like it's sitting on the ground, right? If I delete this out, it just doesn't look very good. And we could mess around with some things, right? Like the Z value of this image, other things like that, but it's not necessarily doing what we want it to do. And so what I want to do in this situation is I actually want to set this up not as a background, but rather as a dome around my image. And so to start off, what we need to do is we need to create our dome. What the dome's going to do is that's going to allow us to project that texture onto the ground in here in a way where it actually kind of surrounds our object with an actual ground object, so it's not floating in space. So to start off, I'm just going to jump into solid shaded mode real quick. I'm just going to do a Shift A. I'm going to add a sphere. So we'll go to UV sphere. We're going to add a sphere. We're going to scale it up like this. All right, so we've got our UV sphere, but we want to make it into a flat dome with a floor. So I'm going to start by tabbing into edit mode. I'm going to go into a front on view right here, but we're going to tap the Z key and go into wireframe mode. And I'm just going to take this whole bottom piece right here, and I'm going to scale it so that it's flat. So I'm going to do an SZ. I'm going to type in a value of 0 right here. So what that's done is that's taken this object and it's kind of made it flat. I'm going to go ahead and move it up like this a little bit so that it's close to this edge right here. But now what we've got is we've got this half dome that's in here. And there's things you could do to make this a little bit smoother. I'm not going to worry too much about that for right now. I'm just going to move this over and I'm going to scale it up. And so now what you've got is you've got this dome around your object. But the problem is that dome is just going to block the light right now because of our current HDRI setup. So we need to change our HDRI setup. Okay, and so what we need to do is we need to take this object, and I'm going to jump over into material preview mode just so we're not rendering this the whole time. But we basically need to take this object and we need to apply that HDRI image to it. So to do that, we're going to go into object mode right here, and we're going to add a shader to this object. And so I'm going to click on new, and notice how this comes in with a principled BSDF shader. We don't want the principled BSDF, we're going to build our own. So I'm just going to delete this. And so what we need in this situation is we need two things. We need something that emits light, right? Because right now, I guess that image is still in the background, but right now, this dome is not actually doing anything. It's just sitting in the space. So we need to do a Shift A, and we need to add an emission shader like this. We also need to add a diffuse. Whoops, that's not what I want. I'm going to do a Shift A, and I want to add a diffuse BSDF shader right here. And so what we're going to do is we're going to mix those together. So I'm going to do a Shift A, I'm going to add a mix shader node, and we'll just drag these into our two shader slots like this. And so notice how at the moment though, this is still just kind of black. And so the reason that it's black is because we need to plug something into this. And so in this case, we're going to add that same environment texture node. So I'm going to do a Shift A and add environment texture right here. And we're going to drag that color into our emission and into our diffuse right here. And so what we want to do is we want to go find that HDR file and link it to this. And notice how nothing's happening because I forgot to plug my shader into my surface node right here. But now I've got my shader in my surface node right here. So if we go into this scene and we look at this, we jump over into rendered view, notice how it's actually lighting this scene using the image in here. And you can adjust things like the emission of this object just like this, but it still doesn't look ideal. And that's because we need to work on the mapping of our texture on this object. I'm going to go back into my world settings, and I'm just going to set this to a simple dark background so this isn't trying to use that to light the scene at the same time. And so what we want to do is we're going to jump back over here real quick into material preview mode, and for this texture, which is the world texture that we've applied on here, we just need to apply that same setup, right? Because the way this is being mapped isn't very good and we can't really adjust it. So we just need to bring in that texture coordinate node, and we need to bring in that mapping node, and we just need to plug those in to our setup. And in this case, we don't want to plug in the generated because the generated is going to give us kind of a funky result in here. Instead, we want to bring, because this is an object, we want to bring in the texture coordinates from the object right here. And so notice how now what that's done is that's given us the ability to adjust the way that this is mapped on this object. So notice what I can do is I can actually adjust this using the vector mapping right here. And what this is doing is this is actually taking the texture that's applied to this dome and it's adjusting the mapping. And you could come in here and you could rotate it as well if you wanted to do that. Notice how if I drag or click and drag holding the shift key, I get a little bit more fine control. Now, one thing we do want to do is we want to make sure that this dome is actually aligned with the bottom of our object like this. And we can do a little bit more rotation right here. But now, okay, and you have one more issue. And the issue is if we jump over into rendered mode, notice how we're not actually getting any shadows on the ground. That's because with the way that the emission is working with this object, we're not actually getting shadows. It's just kind of a limitation of the way that we've got this set up. So what we need to do is we need to add a sun that's going to simulate the lighting from the scene, and we're just going to align that with the brightest point of our object. So I'm just going to do a Shift A to add a sun right here. I'm going to move that up and we want to align it with our scene. Now the problem is if I scroll in here right now, notice how nothing is actually happening. So first off, we want to find the brightest point in our scene, which is going to be over here. And we want to set up our sun so that it kind of aligns with that, right? You can kind of see that if you go outside of the dome. So it's almost best if you just take this and kind of move it where that bright point is, and then you can kind of align it so that it shines down into your scene like this, so maybe a little bit lower. But the problem is, if we go back into the scene right here and we look at our car, the dome is blocking that sun. And so because the dome is blocking that sun, we're not actually seeing any shadows. Okay, and so notice how we've got no shadows in here. What we need to do, and so once we place that sun, what we need to do is we need to select this object right here, and we need to change the way that this is interacting with everything in our scene, meaning that we need to select our dome, go into the object properties, and we want to uncheck the box for shadow right here. So when we uncheck the box for shadow, notice how you start getting some shadows cast by that sun that we've added in our scene. But we've got a little bit of a problem in the sense that I'd bump the emission of this object up inside of my object properties. I'm going to bring that back down to something like 1. Notice how then my shadow starts looking a lot better. But now what we've got is we've got a shadow that's actually being cast on the ground plane that's in here inside of our scene, just like this. And then if you want to make it more pronounced, you can jump over into your sun object, and you can basically, in your sun object, you can adjust the brightness. That's going to adjust the strength of the lighting that comes off of that object. And so in this case, I would recommend, if you want things to be brighter, you probably want to brighten up that sun rather than brightening your HDRI. But notice how that sun is now in there and you're getting the shadow cast on your surface right here. Now, there's some things you could do to kind of like play around with the way this is cast a little bit more. So for example, you might make this a little bit bigger and then adjust the mapping like this. So there's a little bit of playing around with this that you're going to have to do in order to really get the result that you're looking for. But notice how you can use that HDRI image, and you want to make sure that you're aligned with the bottom of your tires right here like this. But you can use that in order to create a full-on lighting environment in your scene as well. And I've seen people do this with things like cube mapping as well, and it works out really well. So definitely worth giving a try. Then you could just render this out, right, by adding a camera and doing a render, that kind of thing. All right, so that's kind of an overview of how you can add HDRI images and use them to light your scenes in Blender. If you do want to learn more about how to use Blender, make sure you check out my course. I will link to that on this page. But as always, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this, and I'll catch you in the next video. Thanks, guys.